The sound of sirens shattered the peaceful afternoon as I stood frozen on my own front lawn, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had done nothing wrong, nothing at all, but there she was, Karen, standing in the middle of my driveway, phone pressed to her ear, voice shrill with manufactured panic. "He's threatening me. I'm terrified. Please, send the police right away." Her words sliced through the air like a blade, each syllable dripping with a false urgency that sent a shiver down my spine. My fists clenched at my sides, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. This couldn't be happening. I had seen entitled people pull stunts before, but this was beyond insane. I glanced toward my neighbor, old Mr. Thompson, who had paused mid-rake, his gaze bouncing between Karen and me, his face a mask of disbelief. He knew. He had seen the whole thing. And yet, none of that would matter when the cops arrived. My pulse pounded in my ears as the realization set in. She had the perfect weapon at her disposal, a false accusation. And worse, the entire world knew what could happen when the wrong person got blamed in a situation like this. Love seeing entitled people get what they deserve. Subscribe for more crazy stories like this. Just 10 minutes ago, my day had been normal. I had just gotten home from work, ready to relax for the evening, when Karen stormed onto my property like she owned it. She had been nothing but a nightmare since she moved into the neighborhood, constantly complaining, making ridiculous demands, and acting as if the entire street revolved around her. But today, she had reached a new level of insanity. "You need to move your car," she had snapped, pointing toward my driveway. My brow furrowed as I looked at my perfectly parked car, exactly where it had always been. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You heard me," she spat. "I have guests coming over, and they need extra parking. You can't just take up space when other people need it." I let out a humorless laugh. "This is my driveway, my property." Her eyes darkened, lips curling into a smug smirk. "Do you know who I am?" The words made my stomach turn. I had heard them before from people just like her, people who believed their mere existence was enough to bend reality in their favor. "Yeah," I muttered. "You're the lady who thinks she runs the neighborhood," she gasped, as if my words had physically struck her. Then, before I could process what was happening, she pulled out her phone. "If you don't move it right now, I will call the police and tell them you threatened me." The audacity left me speechless. She wasn't just entitled. She was dangerous. "You're kidding," I scoffed. "Try me," she hissed, her fingers already dialing. My stomach twisted into knots. If I walked away, she'd spin a story about me running from the scene. If I stayed, I risked getting caught in a fabricated web of lies. Either way, she had already decided that she was going to win. And that's how I ended up here, watching helplessly as she painted herself as a victim while I stood accused of a crime I didn't commit. The moment the patrol car pulled up, my body tensed. I forced myself to stay still, to breathe evenly, to keep my hands visible. The officer stepped out, face unreadable as he surveyed the scene. Karen wasted no time, running toward him like she had just escaped a horror movie. "Oh, thank God you're here," she cried, her voice cracking with fake distress. I was so scared. He was yelling at me, threatening me. I didn't know what he was going to do. The officer's gaze flicked toward me, measuring, assessing. My gut clenched. This was a moment that could change everything. One wrong assumption, one misjudgment, and I could be in cuffs for something I didn't do. "Sir," the officer said, stepping toward me. "What's going on here?" I opened my mouth, ready to explain, but Karen wasn't finished. "He's been harassing me for weeks," she blurted. I felt so unsafe. And when I asked him to move his car, he lost it. He told me he'd make me regret it. My hands curled into fists. Lies. All of it. But how could I prove that in a single moment, with the weight of an accusation already hanging over me? The officer turned back to me, expression unreadable. "Sir, Do you have anything to say about this? My jaw tightened. I could already tell how this would go. He said, she said situation, with no witnesses except a few neighbors who might be too afraid to get involved. But then, before I could speak, I heard the sound of another car pulling up behind the patrol vehicle. My stomach unclenched slightly. I knew that car. I knew it very well. Karen didn't. Her expression flickered, the smug confidence faltering for the first time as she turned to see who had arrived. And the second my father stepped out, uniform crisp, badge gleaming in the sunlight, her entire face drained of color. "Dad," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. My father's gaze swept over the situation in an instant, his years of experience as chief of police sharpening his instincts like a blade. He had seen people like Karen before. He had seen people weaponize the law, twist the truth, and play the system to their advantage. But what Karen didn't realize, what she never even considered, was that she had just tried to pull one over on the wrong family. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The silence that followed my father's arrival was almost deafening. Karen's confident smirk had vanished, replaced by an uneasy flicker of confusion as she realized the man stepping out of the car wasn't just another responding officer, but the chief of police himself. My father's eyes moved between us, taking in the entire scene in a matter of seconds. He had always been the kind of man who could read a room instantly, a skill honed by decades of dealing with liars, criminals, and manipulative people who thought they could twist the law to their advantage. He didn't say anything right away, just watched, waiting for someone to make the next move. Karen, still clutching her phone in her hand as if it were some kind of shield, took a step back, her lips parting like she wanted to speak, but no words came out. She had been so sure of herself just moments ago, so convinced that calling the police would tip the power in her favor. But now, faced with an authority figure she couldn't manipulate, she was scrambling to adjust her approach. The officer who had originally responded turned to my father, clearly aware of who he was, and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. My father, still calm, finally broke the silence. "Someone want to tell me what's going on here?" His voice was level, but there was an edge to it, the kind of tone that made people second-guess their choices before they even spoke. Karen swallowed hard, and for a split second, I thought she might actually back down, might decide that this wasn't a fight she wanted to pick after all. But entitlement is a funny thing. It makes people double down even when they're already losing. She straightened her shoulders and plastered on an expression of pure innocence. "Oh, Chief, I didn't know you were coming," she stammered, her voice suddenly sickeningly sweet, completely different from the hysterical panic she had faked just minutes ago. "I called because I was afraid. Your son, well, he was acting aggressive toward me, and I didn't know what to do. I just wanted him to move his car, and he started yelling at me, threatening me. I was scared for my safety." She even added a small, dramatic tremble to her voice, as if the fear was still fresh, as if she was genuinely the victim here. My father's face remained unreadable. He turned his attention to me, his sharp gaze locking onto mine, and for a moment I felt like I was a kid again, being silently asked if I had done something wrong. But I knew that look well enough to understand the difference. He wasn't doubting me. He was waiting, giving me the floor, trusting me to explain. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm even as anger churned inside me. "She came onto my property, demanding that I move my car," I said, my voice steady. "I told her no because it's my driveway. She didn't like that answer, so she threatened to call the police and lie about me being aggressive. And then she did exactly that." My father didn't even blink as he listened. I could see the gears turning in his mind, his years of experience sorting through the situation like a puzzle. Karen's expression faltered for just a second before she quickly shook her head, forcing herself to regain control. "That's not true," she gasped, eyes darting toward the original officer, as if she still thought she could convince him. He was hostile. I felt cornered. I had no choice but to call for help. My father exhaled slowly, then turned to the officer. Did you witness any aggressive behavior when you arrived? He asked. The officer hesitated, glancing at Karen before finally shaking his head. No, sir. When I got here, they were standing apart. No signs of physical confrontation, just accusations. My father gave a slow nod before turning his attention back to Karen. Did you record anything? He asked. Karen blinked. What? You called 911 because you said you felt threatened, he said evenly. Did you start recording on your phone? Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I was too scared to think about that, she finally said, her voice cracking just enough to sound convincing to someone who didn't know better. But my father had heard every excuse in the book, and he wasn't buying it. He turned to the officer again. Body cam footage? The officer glanced down at his chest, pressing a small button on his uniform. A red light blinked once before the recorded audio began playing. The instant Karen's shrill voice filled the air, I could see her entire body go rigid. If you don't move it right now, I will call the police and tell them you threatened me. The words were crystal clear, a perfect confession caught on tape. And the best part, they were her own. The moment she heard herself, the color drained from her face completely. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, suffocating. Karen looked like a deer caught in headlights, her entire body frozen, as reality crashed down on her. She had spent the last 15 minutes weaving an intricate web of lies, but the evidence had unraveled it in seconds. My father didn't even have to say anything. The weight of the truth was doing all the work for him. So, he said finally, his voice completely devoid of emotion, you threatened to file a false police report. And then you did exactly that. Karen's lips parted like she wanted to protest, but she must have realized there was nothing left to say. Every possible excuse, every possible escape route had been ripped away. She had dug her grave, and now she was standing in it. The officer turned toward her, clearing his throat. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step over here, he said, reaching for his cuffs. And for the first time since this entire ordeal had started, Karen looked genuinely afraid. Karen's breathing had turned shallow, her hands trembling as she took a small step back, eyes darting between my father, the officer, and me as if desperately searching for some escape. But there was none. She had trapped herself in a lie so perfectly woven that even she couldn't slip out of it now. The officer, still calm but firm, gestured for her to come forward, his other hand hovering near his cuffs in case she tried to bolt. Ma'am, I need you to step over here, he repeated, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. But Karen wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. Her mouth opened, her voice coming out as a weak, panicked stammer. Wait. This is all a misunderstanding. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. You can't arrest me for being afraid. She tried to force a laugh, but it cracked halfway, revealing the sheer terror bubbling underneath her fragile exterior. My father watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, his sharp eyes studying every inch of her like he was assessing just how far she was willing to push this. Finally, he let out a slow exhale, crossing his arms over his chest. Karen, he said, his voice low but firm, the kind of tone that didn't need to be loud to be terrifying. Let me explain something to you. There's a difference between being afraid and knowingly making a false police report. You didn't just exaggerate. You didn't misinterpret a situation. You outright fabricated a story, called 911, and wasted police resources on a lie. And the worst part, you did it with the intent to get someone in trouble just because you didn't like the answer they gave you. That's not fear. That's manipulation. Karen's face twisted, her lips trembling as she shook her head wildly. No, that's not what happened. I thought but the words weren't forming anymore. There was no way out. She had played the victim card one too many times, and now that it had backfired, she was left exposed, vulnerable, and worst of all, completely powerless. The officer took a step closer, reaching for her wrist. Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for filing a false police report and misuse of emergency services. The second his hand touched her, the facade shattered completely. No, no, you can't do this. You can't arrest me, Karen shrieked, her voice hitting a pitch so sharp it made my ears ring. She twisted, trying to yank herself away, but the officer was trained for this. In one smooth movement, he had her arm pinned behind her back, securing the cuffs with practiced efficiency. You have the right to remain silent, he started, his voice unwavering, but Karen wasn't interested in hearing her rights. She was still struggling, her body jerking wildly in a last-ditch effort to break free. This is harassment. This is police brutality. I'm the victim here. Her screeches echoed through the neighborhood, and by now, a small group of neighbors had started gathering at a distance, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Some whispered to each other, some shook their heads, and others just stood in stunned silence. This was a moment Karen had always feared. The moment her power, her ability to manipulate and control situations, was stripped away in front of an audience. Her humiliation was complete. My father didn't move, didn't even flinch as he watched the officer secure Karen's other wrist. You brought this on yourself, he said simply. Actions have consequences. But Karen wasn't done yet. Even with the cuffs locked around her wrists, even as she was being led toward the patrol car, she twisted her head back to glare at me, her eyes burning with a fury that almost looked unhinged. This is your fault. You did this to me, she spat, her voice dripping with venom. You think this is over? I'll sue you. I'll sue all of you. I have connections. You'll regret this. The words would have been more intimidating if she wasn't being shoved into the back seat of a police cruiser at that exact moment. The officer sighed, shaking his head as he shut the door behind her, silencing her ranting to little more than muffled shrieks from inside the car. The neighbors had started dispersing, some of them chuckling under their breath as they walked away. I could hear snippets of their conversations. Always knew she pushed too far one day. About time someone put her in her place. Unbelievable. She really thought she could get away with that. My father turned to me, his expression softer now, the hardened authority shifting into something more familiar. You okay? He asked. I nodded, though the adrenaline was still coursing through me, my hands still slightly shaky. Yeah, I said, exhaling slowly. Just didn't expect it to escalate like that. He gave a small nod of understanding. People like her? They don't back down until they hit a wall they can't climb over. He looked toward the patrol car, where Karen was still fuming in the back seat. And today, she hit that wall. A small smirk tugged at the corner of my lips. Yeah, I guess she did. The officer who had arrested Karen walked back over, a small notepad in hand. She'll be booked and processed. You may need to give an official statement later, but with the body cam footage, this is an open and shut case, he said, flipping the notepad shut. Then, glancing at my father, he let out a short chuckle. She really didn't know who she was messing with, did she? My father let out a dry laugh. They never do. I watched as the patrol car pulled away, taking Karen with it, her enraged face barely visible through the rear window before it disappeared down the street. The weight that had been pressing on my chest since this whole ordeal started finally lifted. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe freely again. Justice had been served, and this time it had been swift. The evening air felt different as I stood there watching the patrol car disappear down the street. The weight of everything that had happened still lingered in my chest, but there was also a strange sense of finality. Karen was gone, at least for now, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't in control of the situation. She wasn't barking orders, twisting the truth, or manipulating people into believing her version of reality. No, this time, she had been caught in her own web of lies, and there was no way for her to escape it. My father let out a deep sigh beside me, his arms still crossed as he watched the street, his expression unreadable. The officer had already driven off, taking his report with him. but the aftermath of what had just gone down would ripple through the neighborhood for a long time. People would talk. They would remember. And most importantly, Karen wouldn't be able to erase what had just happened. I turned to my father, still processing everything. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice quieter than I expected. He glanced at me, considering for a moment before answering. "She'll be processed like anyone else. The charges are solid: false police report, misuse of emergency services, and possibly obstruction, depending on how much more she tries to fight it. She'll have to answer for all of it." There was no satisfaction in his voice, just a firm, steady certainty. He had seen too many cases like this before. People who thought they were untouchable until reality proved them wrong. But Karen, she was a different breed entirely. Entitlement like hers didn't just fade overnight. "She's not going to let this go," I muttered, shaking my head. "People like her never do." My father let out a short chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Oh, she'll try," he said, turning fully to face me now. "She'll scream about injustice, claim she was wronged, and try to paint herself as the victim. But the thing is, people saw what happened today. They heard her lies. They watched her get caught. And that's something she won't be able to rewrite, no matter how hard she tries." The thought sent a small spark of relief through me, though I knew deep down that this wouldn't be the last time Karen made a scene. She had spent her entire life bending the world to her will, and people like that didn't just change overnight. But at least for now, she had been forced to face consequences, something I doubted had ever happened to her before. The neighborhood, though returning to its usual evening routine, still buzzed with whispers and lingering glances. Some people gave me nods of approval, others simply watched, no doubt waiting to see what would happen next. It was strange, knowing that the drama was over but still feeling the weight of it in the air. My father clapped a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the house. "Let's get inside. You don't need to stand out here, waiting for round two." I let out a small laugh at that, the tension in my chest finally loosening as I followed him inside. The moment the door shut behind us, it was like a different world entirely. The chaos, the shouting, the sheer absurdity of the past hour, it all felt distant, like something out of a bad movie. My father walked into the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water before leaning against the counter. "You handled yourself well," he said, watching me carefully. "Kept your cool, didn't escalate. That's more than a lot of people would have managed in your situation." I shrugged, rubbing the back of my neck. Didn't really feel like I had much of a choice. Anything I said, she was going to twist it anyway. He nodded slowly, sipping his water. "That's exactly why she lost," he said after a moment. "People like Karen rely on getting a reaction. They want you to lose control so they can point the finger and say, 'See, I was right.' But when you don't give them that, when you stay steady, they run out of moves." I absorbed his words, letting them settle in my mind. He was right. Karen had come into this expecting to win, expecting to get her way like she always had. But when I didn't play her game, when she was finally held accountable, the whole thing crumbled. A part of me still couldn't believe it had actually happened. What if she comes back? I asked, voicing the lingering thought in the back of my mind. My father exhaled through his nose, setting his glass down on the counter. "If she does, she won't have the same advantage," he said simply. "She can scream, threaten, throw another fit. But the moment she tries something like this again, she'll be digging herself into an even deeper hole. And if she's smart," he gave me a pointed look, "she'll realize that." I nodded, though part of me doubted Karen would ever accept defeat that easily. But at the very least, she would have to think twice before pulling another stunt like this. That was something. A small victory, maybe, but a victory nonetheless. The house felt quieter now, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving behind a strange sense of exhaustion. I hadn't realized how tense my body had been until now, every muscle aching from the sheer stress of the situation. "You should get some rest," my father said, reading me like a book. This kind of nonsense takes a lot out of you. I huffed out a laugh. No kidding. I pushed away from the counter, heading toward the stairs. Thanks, Dad, for, everything. He nodded once, the corner of his mouth twitching into the smallest of smiles. Anytime. As I climbed the stairs, I couldn't help but replay the entire ordeal in my head one last time. Karen's arrogance, her unraveling, the moment she realized she had lost. It all played out like a twisted morality lesson. Proof that sometimes, even the most entitled people finally hit a wall they can't break through. And with that final thought, I let out a deep breath, finally allowing myself to relax. For now, at least, it was over.